Tonight's speaker will be introduced by Professor Daniel Usner. He's the Holland McTeer Professor of History of Vanderbilt. Professor Usner is the author of Indian Settlers and Slaves in a Frontier Exchange Economy, the Lower Mississippi Valley before 1783. It's my pleasure to call upon Professor Usner to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Shai. Tonight's speaker in Vanderbilt University's Holocaust Lecture Series is David E. Stannard, Chair of the American Studies Department at the University of Hawaii. In 1992, Professor Stannard published a book entitled American Holocaust, Columbus and the Conquest of the New World, which undoubtedly qualifies him for this year's theme, Oversights of Memory. While speakers and writers across this nation were celebrating the so-called discovery of America, with token recognition of Native American suffering and loss, Stannard had the audacity to show how Columbus's voyages actually launched the violent destruction of indigenous peoples for centuries to come. While American Holocaust is perhaps Stannard's best-known book to date, his publication record reflects a career that is as versatile as it is provocative. David Stannard received his PhD in American Studies from Yale University in 1975. Only 2 years later, his first book was published, In the Puritan Way of Death, a study in religion, culture, and social change. Stannard took on nothing less than the theology of colonial New Englanders. Then, in 1980, came his next book, Shrinking History, on Freud and the Failure of Psychohistory, where he confronted, this time, the efficacy of psychoanalysis, as well as that of psychohistory. Published in 1989, Before the Horror, the Population of Hawaii on the Eve of Western Contact, is a sophisticated demographic analysis of the depopulation of native Hawaiians caused by European contact, which had been underestimated and even minimized for all too long. In American Holocaust, appearing 3 years later, Professor Stannard masterfully synthesized huge amounts of historical and archaeological material that had already been revising what we know and how we think about conquest of the Americas. But it took someone with extraordinary vision and passion to translate all of that scholarship into a compelling narrative with contemporary significance. Since then, another book written by Stannard further demonstrated the wide range of his inquiry. In Honor of Killing, How the Infamous Massey Affair Transformed Hawaii, published in 2005, he explored a relatively unknown murder case in order to examine white supremacy in mid-20th century America and to explain how resistance against it shaped a political revolution in Hawaii. David Stannard has taught at Yale University, Stanford University, and the University of Colorado, and has been on the faculty of the University of Hawaii since 1979. He is the recipient of many honors and awards, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Throughout his bold ventures into comparing and connecting the most horrible of human experiences, Professor Stannard has impressively endured turf wars with early American historians from my field, as well as Jewish Holocaust scholars, among others. In my own teaching of American Indian history, I emphasize how, although teetering on the brink of total destruction in different places at different times, American Indians have managed to survive disease, defeat, disdain, and despair by preserving their cultural traditions, even political autonomy in some cases. And their continuing struggles against impoverishment and marginalization, against assimilationism and racism, hold great significance in American history, as well as in global history. But it takes a scholar like David Stannard to enrich what he calls our necessary comprehension. As he wrote in the preface to American Holocaust, all the ongoing violence against the world's indigenous people, in whatever form, as well as the native people's various forms of resistance to that violence, will persist beyond our full understanding and beyond our ability to engage and humanely come to grips with it until we are able to comprehend the magnitude and the causes of the human destruction that virtually consumed the people of the Americas and other people in other subsequently colonized parts of the globe. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Stannard.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That's the most extraordinary introduction I think I've ever had. Not only is it wonderfully generous, but it's so complete. I had almost forgotten about some of those things that I wrote a long time ago. Let me take a quick preparatory sip of water so I don't have to do it so much while I'm talking. It's good to be here, despite the weather. Very different from the world that I live in. I was telling Daniel and Shia Bear earlier that I had to do some research for a book I'm working on now, and so I had planned this trip with a first stop in Madison, Wisconsin, where I had to go to the archives to look at some stuff, because I figured Madison will be cold by this time and it would be warm there, and I sort of worked my way to the south where it would be warm. And Madison was beautifully warm, and here I am. I guess we could be in Philadelphia, I don't know. But anyway, again, thank you very much, and thank all of you for being here. Last spring, Shia Bear called to ask me if I might be interested in speaking at Vanderbilt's Holocaust Lecture Series this fall. I said that I would be honored, and we then discussed possible topics. He suggested that I revisit a book that I had published 16 years ago, a book that you've just heard about, entitled American Holocaust. Well, 16 years is a long time, so I asked Shia what specifically he was looking for. And he said he thought I should address, among other things, what he called the controversial nature of the book's title, specifically my use of the word Holocaust to describe the destruction of tens of millions of lives in North and South America that occurred as a consequence of European and American conquest and settlement between the 15th and the 19th centuries. I agreed, and then after we hung up, I recalled that the exact same question first came up almost 20 years ago, almost exactly 20 years ago, in fact, in the fall of 1988, when I sat down over lunch with my editor at Oxford University Press to discuss their publishing that same book, although at the time it was nothing more than a 10 or 15-page proposal. Oxford had published two of my previous books, and my editor, Sheldon Meyer, told me he was eager to publish this one as well. The only problem, he said, might be my tentative title, American Holocaust. I told Sheldon that I wasn't insistent on the title. It was one of several that I had in mind, although it did seem to me to be appropriate. As he knew, I was just then finishing a monograph that you've just heard about, that I called Before the Horror, a monograph for another publisher on the massive population collapse suffered by Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders in the wake of European and American contact and colonization. Those demographic disasters had been the result almost entirely of introduced disease. In researching that book, I had, of necessity, done some comparative work on the conquest of the Americas, focusing especially on the devastating impact of introduced diseases such as smallpox, influenza, measles, mumps, and much more among American Indian populations with no previous exposure to them. What I inadvertently had found, however, was much more disturbing, and that was the horrifying level of deliberate and widespread mistreatment, enslavement, ethnic cleansing, and outright mass slaughter of Native peoples that was recorded on page after page, in volume after volume, of the settlers' own historical recollections and records. To me, it appeared to be nothing less than a Holocaust, and that was what I now wanted to write about in this new book. But to make this already too long story a little bit shorter, Sheldon Meyer and I agreed to sign a book contract that day with the understanding that the title would be subject to negotiation once the work was complete. 3 years later, as scheduled, I submitted the manuscript. In a cover letter, I listed some possible alternative titles. A week or so later, I received a phone call from Sheldon. A letter was on its way, he said, detailing some suggested changes in the manuscript, but one thing was settled. The title would be American Holocaust. There was no question, he said, that what I had described did indeed constitute a Holocaust. Now, I'd like to add something here, a little digression, because that probably is insufficient for some of you, I would think. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about something that I think was probably implicit in my conversation with Sheldon, which is why we didn't pursue it. But something that addresses Shaya's question to me more directly. Holocaust is a very old word, dating back to at least the 13th century, and originally meaning a sacrifice consumed by fire or a burnt offering. Later, around the 15th century, it began taking on a more general and secular meaning, specifically a great slaughter or sacrifice. Thus, in the early 16th century, the famous Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas used the word Holocaust to describe the Spaniards' ongoing destruction of immense numbers of native people in the Caribbean and Latin America. Holocaust also was used on various occasions from the 16th through the 18th centuries in reference to the massacres of Irish civilians by English soldiers and colonists. And among other instances, in the late 19th century, the word Holocaust appeared in a New York Times headline above a story describing the slaughter of more than 5,000 Armenians in eastern Turkey, part of an ongoing mass killing campaign there. Holocaust again appeared repeatedly during World War II, as historian Peter Novick has observed in reference, and I'm quoting Novick, to the totality of destruction wrought by the Axis, not to the special fate of the Jews. In fact, Novick points out only in the 1960s, in the aftermath of the trial in Israel of the Nazi criminal Adolf Eichmann, did English language publications begin referring to the Holocaust, a loosely translated reference to the Hebrew word Shoah. Like most people, I commonly refer in speaking and writing to the Holocaust, with exclusive reference to the slaughter of 6 million Jews in the Nazis' massive extermination campaign. But I don't believe it makes sense to expect the word Holocaust suddenly to disappear from the English language following World War II, except with reference to the Nazi Judeocide. By this same logic, we should be prohibited from using the word calamity, except with reference to the Armenian genocide or the 19th century Irish famine, each of which killed at least 1 million people, and each of which has been designated in capital letters and in quotes, the great calamity by their victims. The same logic would suggest that we strike the word devouring from everyday speech, since that is the English translation of poraimus, the capitalized Roma word for the genocide perpetrated against gypsies by the Nazis. Other examples of genocide victims using a particular word to memorialize their suffering, of course, abound. It just doesn't make sense to banish a word from everyday usage because one group or another has adopted it in reference to their victimization. And no doubt, that's why my use of the word Holocaust, not the Holocaust, in referring to the destruction of the indigenous peoples in the Americas, actually was very little remarked upon following the publication of my book. Much more controversial was my use of another word, and that word was genocide. One of the reasons that became controversial is that by employing it, I was joining an ongoing debate about the uniqueness of the Holocaust. I'll talk about that debate, and I should, as an aside here, I really didn't discuss that very thoroughly in American Holocaust, but I did in a subsequent lengthy essay, which I'll get to later. And I'll talk about that debate, the uniqueness debate, shortly. But first, it's important to have some sense of why many people who knew nothing about that debate were still instantly resistant to my use of the word genocide. Excuse me. American Holocaust was published on Columbus Day, 1992. Earlier that same year, Oxford University Press also published a book by the prominent literary scholar and cultural critic Jane Tompkins, then of Duke University. Her book was entitled West of Everything, with the West referring to the American West. It was a sweeping and a wide-ranging book that included discussions of women in the West, white women at least, popular Western fiction, Buffalo Bill, and much else. It even had a separate chapter on horses and another separate chapter on cattle. Only one thing was missing: Indians, the native people of the West. How could that happen? Tompkins addressed the question in her preface. "I forgot," is what she wrote. That's what she said. I forgot. Although, to be fair, she did express regret for forgetting. As she put it, and I'm quoting her, "The Indians had been decimated by disease, removal, and conquest, and now I had ignored them." So she wrote, "I cried." And then she returned to putting the final touches on her manuscript. I don't recount this story to be critical of Jane Tompkins, but rather to suggest that her self-confessed memory loss was representative and in some ways perhaps symbolic of the attitudes of most Americans, and understandably so. That's the way it's supposed to be. Consider this. In the late 1940s, following almost 3 centuries of colonial and then federal assaults on Indians, from mass murder, land confiscation, ethnic cleansing by way of forced removal, and then confinement of the small remnant of survivors to what were often barren enclaves known as reservations, the American government decided to establish an Indian policy it officially called liquidation. When some people pointed out that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, that term might suggest unsavory connotations, the government changed it to termination. Whatever the allegedly fine distinction between those two words, the specific words themselves don't matter. Either one was fully appropriate to what was planned. The idea behind the new policy was to extinguish once and for all everything that was Indian about Indians by abolishing their tribes and their treaty relationships while seizing what was left of their land. It was to be an extermination campaign, not one aimed at individual lives, but at the entirety of these indigenous peoples' greatly varied and distinctive ethnicities, nationalities, cultures, and religions, all of which are tied to tribal identities and ancestral land bases. The Indians, of course, resisted this extermination campaign, just as they had resisted invasion and conquest and annihilation for centuries. But in just a dozen years, between 1954 and 1966, when the policy itself finally was terminated, more than 100 tribes and bands had been dissolved and more than 1.3 million acres of Indian land had been taken. This was on top of the countless other tribes, millions of lives, and 2 billion acres of land that had been destroyed, lost, or seized from Indians before the end of the 19th century. So perhaps it's not surprising that Jane Tompkins forgot about the Indians. That was the whole idea. And actually, by 1992, when American Holocaust was published, such forgetfulness was a comparatively benign attitude, considering how many other historians and pundits preferred to figuratively dance on the Indians' graves. One culprit among many was someone whose name you may know, because he's still writing today, Christopher Hitchens. I single him out only because he was not at that time a predictable reactionary, but was in one of his self-proclaimed leftist phases and still writing as a columnist for The Nation. As Columbus Day drew near, Hitchens briefly acknowledged in his column that American Indians had indeed suffered as the Euro-American empire rolled over them. And then he celebrated that historical fact, charging that those who might lament the horrors of the Indians' experience were, and I'm quoting his words here, self-hating, ridiculous, ignorant, and sinister people, unable to face the simple fact that the massive destruction of technologically backward peoples, quote, happens to be the way history is made. Hitchens announced that he, for one, would celebrate those centuries of horror with great vim and gusto. Well, this is an attitude with a long history and, unfortunately, a widespread and indeed international presence even today. Perhaps some of you know the name Benny Morris, a professor of history at Ben Gurion University in Israel and a prominent author of books on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A few years ago, he decided to bring American Indians into that discussion. In an interview with the distinguished Israeli newspaper Haaretz, a piece that was entitled Survival of the Fittest, Morris was discussing how he recently had come to justify what he openly called, and I'm quoting him here, ethnic cleansing during the 1948 uprooting of 700,000 Palestinians to establish the Jewish state, unquote. After all, he explained, and let me quote him again, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Even the great American democracy could not have been created without the annihilation of the Indians. There are cases in which the overall final good justifies harsh and cruel acts that are committed in the course of history. The Haaretz interviewer described Morris's words as chilling, terrible, hard to listen to. He was shocked, but he shouldn't have been. Murderous immorality of this sort and the racism that is routinely interlaced with it are commonly encountered in this particular intellectual territory. They are part of its context. And that is because, as the old cliche has it, history is written by the victors. However, it's quite a different story on those rare occasions when the perpetrators of genocide lose. Take the most infamous case of all, Germany in the 1930s and 40s, when, to adopt Benny Morris's own self-justifying terminology, the ideology of the Nazi regime perceived an overall final good to be derived from what it regarded as the justifiable annihilation of Jews, Gypsies, and others. Today in Germany, because the Nazis lost, there is no equivalent of Christopher Hitchens celebrating the destruction of Jews with great vim and gusto, at least not in the pages of one of that country's oldest and most liberal and respected magazines. On the contrary, to deny the very existence of the Holocaust in Germany is a criminal offense that can lead to imprisonment, as it can in other European countries as well. Moreover, Germany is home to at least 8 major Holocaust memorials or museums, among more than 60 similar institutions throughout the world, including a dozen or so in the United States. And this is as it should be. But where in Germany is the memorial to, say, the Herero people? The Herero are one of several national and ethnic groups in Southwest Africa who also felt Germany's genocidal wrath, but decades before the Holocaust, at the turn of the 20th century. By the time the killing ended, 2/3 of the natives of that region had been wiped out by the Germans, exterminated. Although the total number killed was far lower than the Holocaust, this was roughly the same rate of extermination as the one suffered by European Jews during the 1930s and 40s. Moreover, in the midst of the killing, in 1906, a German military commander published a book that justified the slaughter as necessary for attainment of what Benny Morris so cheerfully later called the overall final good. And like Morris, a century later, he used the United States treatment of American Indians as a touchstone. This process, he wrote, referring to the extermination of what he called the weak and purposeless Africans, and I'm quoting him here, is played out elsewhere and in a variety of ways, such as, for example, in the elimination of the American Indians because they were without purpose in the continued development of the world, unquote. They were without purpose. Note the casual past tense in referring to the millions of native people who once lived in North America alone, to say nothing of the vastly greater numbers who had lived in Mexico and Central and South America, but who by that time in North America had been reduced in number by more than 90% to several hundred thousand. An American president of that same era expressed much the same sentiment, and with equal satisfaction. He began with a comment about one particular unprovoked late 19th century raid by U.S. soldiers on an Indian community in Colorado, a raid planned specifically for a time when all the young Indian men would be away hunting, so there would only be unarmed women, children, and old men in the village. As the troops approached on horseback, the Indians waved to welcome them, and the elders held a large white flag aloft. A short time later, hundreds of Indians, almost everyone in the village, lay dead. In the aftermath, according to subsequent accounts of the soldiers themselves, they went systematically from body to body, scalping and mutilating the dead, castrating the corpses of old men and small boys. Let me just quote a snippet of one soldier's lengthy testimony before the United States Congress, and many of them testified. Quote, "The men used their knives," he said, "ripped open women, clubbed little children, beat their brains out. In numerous instances, men cut out the private parts of females and stretched them over their saddle bows and wore them over their hats while riding in the ranks. One man cut a squaw's heart out and stuck it up on a stick." When asked about this ghastly event, President Theodore Roosevelt, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, said it was as righteous and beneficial a deed as ever took place on the frontier. Later, referring to the overall long history of the destruction of the American Indians, Roosevelt dismissed any possible concerns by saying that the Indians were, quote, "an alien race that held a coveted prize in its feeble grasp," unquote. That prize was land, and the Americans wanted it. Therefore, the Indians' annihilation, the president concluded, was both, I'm quoting him again, beneficial and inevitable. Today, in the post-Holocaust era, such racist and genocidal boastfulness usually is frowned upon, at least in polite company. In its place, especially on the international stage, is the silence of denial. The silence of Belgium is an example, home to an acclaimed museum of African history and culture, a museum that until very recently made no mention anywhere of the horrors of the Congo, where more than 8 million Africans perished under the bloodthirsty colonial rule of Belgium's King Leopold, or the denial of Turkey over complicity in the Armenian genocide, or Japan over culpability for the so-called rape of Nanking, and on and on and on. There are various reasons and rationalizations behind such efforts to ignore or deny the existence of genocides or to systematically minimize their magnitude. National pride, and its flip side, potential national shame, is one reason, of course. But one nation's genocidal denial frequently is aided and abetted by a chorus of support from others, political allies around the world. Thus, one reason Turkey has been able to remain so adamant in its official denial of the Armenian genocide is support for this denial by the governments of the United States and Israel, both of them fearful of damaging bilateral trade and diplomatic relationships with Turkey. In the opposite spirit of denial, that is, the spirit of never forget, there is a wall in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum inscribed with a warning, something Adolf Hitler reportedly said one day in 1939 on the eve of the Nazi invasion of Poland. It's a famous phrase. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? More apt, then, on this day, I believe, nearly 70 years later, is another question. Who, after the crushing of Nazi Germany in 1945, could have imagined that the United States and Israel, of all countries, would help to perpetuate that convenient forgetfulness about the annihilation of the Armenians, and with it, Hitler's murderous cynicism on into the 21st century. Indeed, it was only a half dozen years ago that the current president of Israel, Shimon Peres, declared the Armenian genocide to be historically meaningless. This prompted a particularly angry reply from within Israel by a man named Israel Charny, the executive director of the Institute on the Holocaust and Genocide in Jerusalem. In a letter to Peres, Charny wrote that Peres had, quote, gone beyond a moral boundary that no Jew should ever allow himself to trespass, adding that specific remarks on the Armenian genocide being meaningless were comparable to denials of the Holocaust. This sort of statement is not unusual for Israel Charny. For many years, he has ferociously fought back against the evil of Holocaust denial, while at the same time resisting efforts to set the Holocaust apart, as in his words, I'm quoting him, the ultimate event against which all other tragedies of genocide, a genocidal mass death, are to be tested and invariably found wanting. For me, he writes, the passion to exclude this or that mass killing from the universe of genocide, as well as the intense competition to establish the exclusive superiority or unique form of any one genocide, ends up creating a fetishistic atmosphere in which the masses of bodies that are not to be qualified for the definition of genocide are dumped into a conceptual black hole where they are forgotten, unquote. Which finally brings me back to the genocidal destruction of North and South America's native people, and the strong resistance by some commentators to my use of the word genocide in describing that destruction. Commentators like the recently convicted felon, Senator Ted Stevens, who threatened to use his considerable power to cut off funding of the Smithsonian Institution if it used the word genocide, as it had planned to do in a documentary film on the destruction of the America's native people. Commentators, in short, who would prefer that those millions of bodies remain buried and forgotten in Charny's conceptual black hole. For those of you unfamiliar with the story of what happened to the indigenous peoples of the Americas during the course of 4 long centuries, from Columbus's first landing at Hispaniola in 1492 to the massacre at Wounded Knee in December of 1890, or over the course of 5 centuries, if we bring accounts forward to the US-supported genocide in Guatemala during the 1980s and beyond, I must confess that it is impossible for me here tonight to describe specific events in any detail. That's what I did over the course of several hundred pages in American Holocaust, and even then I barely scratched the surface of what, in North America alone, began with the deliberate, calculated extermination of the Indians of Virginia in the 17th century, what Yale genocide scholar Ben Kiernan recently described as a genocide on the Carthaginian model. So total was the destruction, to the state and federally financed mass killing of 60% of California's Indians in just 8 years in the middle of the 19th century. For what happened on other blood-soaked soil during the 2 centuries in between these genocides, sorry, I lost my place. I'm afraid you'll have to read American Holocaust or some of the more recent works that I will mention later. Let me just say for the moment, however, that the claim of Euro-American genocide as one of the primary agents responsible for the deaths of millions of indigenous people throughout the Western Hemisphere was hardly original with me. In fact, the first person to make that case was the very man who coined the word genocide and who relentlessly and heroically pressed the United Nations to declare it an international crime, a law professor and a Polish Jew who had lost 49 members of his family in the Holocaust, Raphael Lemkin. It's commonly thought that in his efforts to name and define genocide as a crime, Lemkin was focused exclusively on the then ongoing extermination of Jews in Nazi Germany, and this is incorrect. Recent research in the Lemkin archives at New York's American Jewish Historical Society, the New York Public Library, and the Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati has revealed the existence of detailed manuscript writings from the 1940s in which Lemkin, obviously preparing at least one book on genocide, probably more, left numerous folders filed under what he regarded as a variety of genocidal events in history, including, and the titles are his, quote, Spanish treatment of South American Indians, North American Indians, extermination, History of Genocide, projected book on North American Indian research, and much more. In a 1948 report to a foundation that was supporting his work, Lemkin listed what he called 10 specific genocide cases, this is the phrase he used, on which he was compiling information, and I quote, to be made available to the United Nations Drafting Committee on Genocide. One of those 10 cases is labeled the Indians in Latin America. Another is the Indians in North America. And then finally, in the 1950s, Lemkin's archives reveal still more folders bulging with information on these subjects, including the draft of a 100-page essay on genocide against Indians, one that includes sections on their incarceration in what he calls concentration camps. He was, of course, referring to reservations. By the late 1950s, Lemkin had almost completed a massive book on genocide in world history, the entire third section of which was to be given over to genocides in colonial settings, with separate chapter titles listed on genocide against the American Indians, Latin America, genocide against the Aztecs, the Yucatan, genocide against the Incas, and then on to European genocides against the natives of New Zealand, Australia, Southwest Africa, and more. But in 1959, Lemkin died of a heart attack in a hotel room in New York City. He was not yet 60 years old. The book was unfinished. But even if it had been completed, it probably never would have been published, because by then a new orthodoxy was beginning to take hold in the United States and elsewhere, one that viewed the Holocaust as a singular, unique, genocidal event in world history. To some proponents of this idea, the Holocaust was not only the preeminent genocide, it was the only genocide. Whereas Lemkin apparently felt that acknowledging the suffering of others had no bearing on the recognition of one's own painful experience, some among this new generation regarded the Holocaust as moral capital. I'm sorry, I mumbled that, moral capital. To cite one representative writer, moral capital that risked being plundered by others who sought acknowledgement of their own horrific experiences. In this emerging climate of opinion, authors who chose to utter even mildly critical comments about aspects of the new orthodoxy, including such distinguished Jewish political theorists and historians as Hannah Arendt and Raoul Hilberg, found themselves being abused in print and blackballed for expressing their points of view. For the better part of 3 decades, this sort of exclusivist thinking dominated scholarly discussion about the Holocaust. So much so, in fact, that in the early 1990s, the distinguished Princeton historian, Arno J. Mayer, himself a Jew, found his classes being boycotted by Jewish students and his name placed in a rogues gallery of so-called Hitler apologists, published by the Anti-Defamation League. Hitler apologists. Why? Because in a book entitled Why Did the Heavens Not Darken, Mayer had dared to criticize what he saw as 2 camps of historical extremists. In his words, and I'm quoting him, those 2 camps were revisionists, who categorically deny the Judeocide, and dogmatists who seek to reify and sacralize the Holocaust. In this latter camp were numerous prominent scholars who vigorously condemned anyone who dared to engage in comparative genocide research. Research, wrote one such author, that might taint the Holocaust by including it as merely, and I'm quoting, one among an array of other conflagrations in which innocents were massacred, unquote. The Holocaust is unique. It stands alone. Nothing can be compared with it. So said those scholars. Professor Mayer had criticized as Holocaust dogmatists. Indeed, according to historian Stephen T. Katz, writing in the 1990s, the Holocaust not only is unique, it is the only true genocide that has ever occurred. Thus, when asked in 1994 what he thought of the recent and ongoing mass killings in Bosnia and Rwanda, Katz replied that the Bosnia situation was merely, and I quote, a population transfer supported by violence, unquote, while the slaughter of 800,000 people over the course of 3 months in Rwanda was, he said, not genocidal, but simply a struggle for tribal domination. The strong influence of this line of thinking throughout much of the world of genocide scholarship at that time not only served to sacralize the Holocaust, as Mayer had put it, it also, intentionally or not, provided a cover of pseudo-respectability for those very secular political forces throughout the world, including the United States, Turkey, and elsewhere, that were interested in denying genocides that had occurred in their own backyards. This was the generally prevailing opinion on the matter when American Holocaust was published in 1992. But by the mid-1990s, times were changing again. Among other things, in the wake of the Columbian Quincentennial, a City University of New York historian named Henry Huttenbach began to privately publish a small circulation newsletter called the Genocide Forum. Huttenbach, a specialist in the Holocaust, Germany, and the Soviet Union, staked out a position far different from that held by Katz and his supporters. If anything, in certain respects, it appeared more closely aligned with the thinking of such people as Israel Charney and his Jerusalem Institute on the Holocaust and Genocide. In the very first issue of the Genocide Forum, Huttenbach wrote that the narrowly exclusive focus on the Holocaust of far too many genocide scholars was inevitably leading to what he called a stifling intellectual parochialism and the dead end of antiquarianism. He called instead for a vigorous collaboration among a wide range of genocide scholars to explore what might be learned from an aggressively comparative study of this horrific phenomenon, specifically citing as clear examples of genocide deserving of more study the killing of Roma by the Third Reich, the slaughter of indigenous people in South America, and the recent mass murders in Bosnia and Rwanda. All of these were incidents that Stephen Katz and others had flatly rejected as actual genocides. Then Huttenbach took direct aim by way of a scathing review of Katz's new 700-page opus, a book entitled The Holocaust in Historical Context, that relentlessly advanced the Holocaust exclusivist line. Katz did his own reputation no favors by replying immediately with an intemperate and wildly ad hominem attack, saying that Huttenbach, and I'm quoting, would have made a good editor of Der Stürmer, unquote, the most famous and vile anti-Semitic propaganda publication of the Nazis, a publication whose actual editor was executed by the Allies after being convicted of crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials. Clearly, by this time, if nothing else, things were heating up in the little world of genocide scholarship. Next, out of the box, in 1995, was a book of essays edited by Alan S. Rosenbaum entitled, Is the Holocaust Unique? That volume contained pieces on the Nazi extermination campaign against gypsies, the Atlantic slave trade, the Armenian genocide, the Stalinist terror famine, the case of the American Indians, and others, including, of course, the Holocaust. Stephen Katz wrote the essay on the Holocaust, and I wrote the one on American Indians. The entire affair became something of a colorful, if minor, academic scandal when one of the authors, me, received a misaddressed fax revealing that the editor of the book had been sending the other contributors' essays to his friend, Professor Katz, so that he might anticipate and deal with their arguments in his own essay. Katz also was serving as something of a ghost editor, recommending to Rosenbaum deletions in some essays, including mine, that were critical of Katz and his work. Now, if all of this sounds to some of you, at least some of you who are professors, as the sort of academic comedy we all get a little laugh over when we read about it in the Chronicle of Higher Education, perhaps that's because the Chronicle of Higher Education did do a rather large, albeit poorly reported, story on the controversy. For better or worse, however, this little tempest did bring outside attention to bear on what was becoming an otherwise arcane academic dispute, and conveniently a dispute that at that moment finally was reaching consensus on one essential point. That consensus, the one thing that almost everyone now agreed upon, even Stephen Katz and me, was that if the Holocaust was to be shown as unique, beyond the trivial ways in which all major historical events possess unique characteristics, it would have to be based on the matter of demonstrated genocidal intent by the perpetrator, not on the magnitude of a particular slaughter, the percentage of people killed, the speed of the killing, or anything else, because it had by that time been fully demonstrated that in each of these categories, other groups of genocide victims from the very distant to the very recent past had equal or stronger claim to the dubious mantle of most extreme victimhood. Alas, however, as by now you might have guessed would happen, this consensus only led to some further dispute, this time specifically regarding the definition of the word intent. Now, although this may sound to some of you, at least those of you who aren't lawyers, as legalistic hair-splitting, in fact, how we define genocidal intent is a very serious matter. Indeed, one that not infrequently in contemporary criminal cases tried before the International Criminal Court involves matters of life and death. Unfortunately, the time available to me tonight, I'm already running a little bit over time, I think, the time available to me tonight doesn't permit a foray into this definitional thicket. To do so adequately would require another entire lecture on such matters as the meanings and, in practice, the limitations of such terms as specific intent, general intent, and more recently, joint criminal enterprise, or JCE. Let me just a little aside, joint criminal enterprise is an intent-related concept that has been proposed as a way of dealing with the extraordinary difficulty to date of getting convictions in the International Criminal Court, although some critics regard the concept as so expansive that they suggest the letters JCE more properly reflect an attitude of just convict everyone. And as an aside, and something you might think about having somebody to speak here, if she's still here, I don't know this person, but I might add that you have a professor in your own law school here who's an expert on JCE and other related matters. Her name is Alison Marston Danner. Without the luxury of a second entire lecture on the problems of defining intent, then, let me simply assure you that the fine points of distinction among various ways of calculating genocidal intent in contemporary human rights cases provide no impediment to the overpowering case that now exists for recognizing genocide as a driving force in the Euro-American conquest of the Americas, or other previously disputed genocides for that matter. Last year, even the Anti-Defamation League, which you will recall once called historian Arno Mayer a Hitler apologist for rejecting the uniqueness of the Holocaust, even the ADL has now acknowledged that the Armenians did indeed suffer a genocide. For any of you interested in pursuing these questions further, I have some suggestions. Some students perhaps might be willing to follow up on this. First, you'll recall a name I mentioned a few minutes ago, Henry Huttenbach, who in the early 1990s founded the modest newsletter he called the Genocide Forum, a newsletter that he wrote entirely himself, and that took as part of its charge, the refutation of the concept of Holocaust uniqueness or exclusivity. Well, in the late 1990s, Huttenbach established a much more ambitious publication, the Journal of Genocide Research, which has now arguably grown to be the leading journal in its field. It has attracted an extraordinarily accomplished array of scholars from throughout the world, highly sophisticated specialists in the history of genocide on every continent. Of particular interest to many of these scholars, even those such as Dirk Moses and Norbert Finch and Dominic Schaller and Jürgen Zimmerer, whose principal expertise rests in German history and the Holocaust. Among their interests is also a concern with the legacy of Raphael Lemkin and his interest in the numerous genocides that have been perpetrated against indigenous peoples. The matter of genocidal intent, I might add, is addressed in a number of essays in this journal. Moreover, in addition to a decade's worth of extensive collected writings on this topic and others in the Journal of Genocide Research, including a recent special issue on Lemkin that explores his research on genocide against indigenous peoples and settler colonies, in the past 4 years, Dirk Moses at the University of Sydney has edited 3 major books on this subject, carrying the titles Genocide and Settler Society, published in 2004, Colonialism and Genocide, 2007, and Empire, Colony, Genocide, just published a few months ago in 2008. Collectively, they contain dozens of penetrating essays on colonial genocide in North and South America, Australia, Africa, Indonesia, and elsewhere, as well as extremely important new work on theoretical questions in genocide research, including some explorations of whether or not settler colonies may be inherently genocidal. At this same time, there's been an outpouring of new and path-breaking scholarship by others, such as Mark Levine of the University of Southampton and the Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish, non-Jewish Relations, who in 2005 published the first 2 volumes of a major and still developing project entitled Genocide in the Age of the Nation-State. Last year, meanwhile, Ben Kiernan, who I mentioned earlier, the founding director of the Genocide Studies program at Yale, published his massive book, Blood and Soil, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur, a volume which devotes fully a third of its pages to the Spanish conquest of the New World, as well as genocides perpetrated against indigenous peoples under regimes of settler colonialism in such places as 16th century Ireland, 19th century Australia and Africa, and North America from the dawn of the 1600s to the close of the 19th century. There's even an excellent textbook now available entitled Genocide, a comprehensive introduction by Adam Jones, a portion of which explores in detail the theoretical and substantive arguments leading to the inescapable conclusion that the native people of the Americas were indeed victims of genocide. In short, although it has been a contentious passage from the publication of American Holocaust 16 years ago down to the present, there really is no longer much question as to what the proper term should be for the euphemism of American expansion, the phrase that most of us learned in our high school and college history classes. It was indeed Euro-American expansionism that made the United States what it is today, but expansionism so bloody that it worked hand in glove with genocide as it made its way across the continent. If we are now, as a nation, edging closer to a widespread recognition of that reality, however, another critical task lies ahead. The American Holocaust is a matter of history, but the wreckage that it caused remains vividly evident among many of its survivors' descendants today. From the desert southwest of Arizona to the Black Hills of South Dakota and beyond, many American Indian communities barely survive, mired in poverty and despair that has little equal except in some of the world's most desperately impoverished so-called third world countries. Alcoholism, diabetes, and suicide rates are sky high, while infant mortality and life expectancy rates at places like Pine Ridge Reservation are as bad as in Haiti and some of the poorest countries of Africa. At the University of Hawaii, I teach a course on race and racism, and one of the central things I try to make clear is that racism kills. It's not just American Indians. Low-income black men have a median life expectancy roughly 10 years below the national average. Multiply those 10 years by the number of low-income black males in a single generation, and the result is the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of lifetimes that should have been lived, but that weren't. And it's not just the poverty. Racism as an agent unto itself is a killer. Recent research, initiated by a group of physicians in Chicago, is showing that college-educated, middle-class black women give birth to premature and dangerously underweight babies at almost 3 times the rate of comparably educated and situated white women in America. I should note that preterm birth not only is a leading cause of death in infants, but those who survive face a high probability of lifetimes damaged by learning disabilities, hypertension, diabetes, and coronary artery disease. So since this research controls for differences in education and income, all the indicators point to extreme stress as the primary cause of this health crisis. The stress of simply living day to day as a black woman, regardless of social class, in a deeply racist society. Of course, what I'm talking about here regarding African Americans is the pathological residue of centuries of slavery, Jim Crow, and ongoing institutional racial discrimination today. The same imposed pathologies are insidiously at work in many American Indian communities, and the damage being done is heartbreaking. Thus, while it is essential that we as a nation face up to the genocidal realities of our past, that's only the beginning. The simmering bigotry and malign neglect of the present continue to kill those people among us whose ancestors first settled this land thousands and thousands of years ago. It's way past time for the nation as a whole and for all of us to begin repairing that terrible damage. Thank you. We got through the whole thing without water, pretty good.
So I guess as a historian, maybe it's not it is your job, I suppose, to document Holocaust and genocide, and perhaps not to address the causes. But would you comment about that? For example, some people think that with the world getting more and more populated, we may have reached a sensible bound of the number of people that can live with a given amount of resources and live in harmony, that things could get worse. Other people think that we've, to some extent, overcome our DNA tendencies and things may get better. Do you have a projection and any comment on the causes?
Well, a couple of things. One, first of all, I noticed that in the, I got the program for the year, and I noticed that it indicates, and I got this after I had already prepared my talk, that it refers to the fact that in American Holocaust, I talk about Christianity as a driving force, I believe. Christianity, not necessarily, or not entirely, as in its theoretical form, but as it was interpreted and used down through the centuries, and as it merged with an emerging Western cultural framework, I think was intensely important in the destruction that happened throughout North and South America. And all you have to do is read the justifications by the Spaniards, by the Puritans. One of the quotations I was going to use in my talk that I left out because the talk was already getting too long was William Bradford, the first governor of Plymouth Colony, who didn't use the word Holocaust to describe what the Puritans had done to a group of Indians, the Pequots, but his description, a lush, rich description of how wonderfully they had burned them and how the lives of all these people were being extinguished in the fires of the Puritans' assault, so much so that their blood, obviously some literary license here, their blood was extinguishing the flames that engulfed them. Is an incredible statement, really, of Holocaust, but of a religious interpretation of the genocide that was being perpetrated. So I think there is a cultural, as well as you're talking really about much more material causes, environmental reasons, and so on and so forth. But I think there's a cultural, religious design behind a lot of genocides as well. I also think, and I'm really not by no means an expert on the environmental conditions that you're talking about, the population statistics and so on and so forth. I know the world is being overpopulated and so on and so forth, but I can recall the debates in the 1970s between, let's see, who were they? Paul Ehrlich was one who wrote a book called The Population Bomb. Some of you are old enough to remember this, I hope. What was his name? Barry Commoner, who was a critic of Paul Ehrlich, who was also a student of the environment. And Commoner's argument was that actually it's not the numbers of people that are the problem, it's the distribution of resources that's the problem. And he felt that actually with a decent distribution of resources, we're a long way away from really necessarily being an overcrowded planet. Which doesn't mean that one in a particular situation cannot interpret the immediate situation as being one in which more land is needed, Lebensraum, in the case, the infamous case, or as Theodore Roosevelt said, and I mentioned in my talk, that the Indians had something that we wanted, which was the land. So I guess I'm not, I don't think that we are necessarily at a point now or in the near future where overcrowding, where simple numbers of people would generate genocide. But any given situations can be interpreted any which way by people, so I'm sure we will see more. If we didn't, it would be for the first time in a couple of thousand years. Anybody else? Wow, pull up that microphone. Okay.
I guess the question I have is connected to his question to some extent. I guess also to the comment that you made about the redistribution as well. I mean, I'm thinking
That's a very unpopular phrase in some circles these days, you know, right?
But basically, I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the case of the Congo. I read a year or so ago a book called King David.
Right.
And there was an economic incentive
Mhm.
for going in. There was rubber, and you could use rubber for lots of wonderful things. And so what was going on there is what someone like David Harvey, a geographer,
Right.
refers to as accumulation by dispossession, which has the, can accomplish wonderful things. You go in and you dispossess people, take them off their land, and then they no longer have access to the means of producing that or reproducing themselves, basically the means to living, so you force them to work for you.
Right.
And I'm wondering to what extent that might be true of various genocides. So certainly there's a religious factor, but I'm wondering whether in certain cases, or perhaps the majority of cases, you have this economic incentive, whether it be land, whether it be resources on that land, or basically subject putting people in a position where they have to, the only way they can make money
Mhm.
or live is by doing work for others.
Yeah, well, of course, the ultimate example of that, again, was the Nazis' slave camps, working people to death. But in the Americas, although, I mean, there's a lot of distinctions from one place to another, distinctions from even parts of the Northeast or the Southwest or so on. But particularly, there's a major, clear distinction, I think, between the Spanish genocide and the British genocide. That is, the genocide that took place in the Caribbean and in South America, and the one that took place in North America. In North America, there were no resources. There was to be mined, really. What there was land, and the Indians were to be pushed off of the land. Not necessarily to be exterminated, but if they chose not to go easily, then to be exterminated. Whereas in South America, there were massive resources that the Spanish were after. And in Peru, for example, there were incredible silver mines in which they simply enslaved thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people, drove them off the land, and just used them up. Life expectancy at the most infamous of the silver mines, was estimated by the Spanish at something around 6 months once the Indians were enslaved and put down into the mines to go to work. So yeah, I'm sure there are many examples of precisely that sort of thing. Now, the justification, I mean, again, ever since my first book that was mentioned earlier here about the Puritan way of death, which is really about Protestant theology and the way it played itself out, I believe, in certain social functioning. One of the things that always troubled me about studying the Puritans, even as a graduate student, I don't know how many of you here are students of early American history, is the assumption that historians have that in Puritan New England, everybody was imbued with and infused with this theology. In fact, a relative elite really understood what was going on in the theological teachings. People, they knew the ritual, they knew what they were supposed to be doing, so they did learn the processes, the basic things that they had to know, but they were not necessarily, I don't believe, being driven by the same theological intensity that the priesthood was, that the elites were. And I think that's true all over the place. I think it's, what you do is look at the rates of illegitimacy in Rome around the corner from the Vatican to see that. But I think it was certainly true among Spaniards in South America and in Mexico. They were always accompanied by priests, and the priests were justifying in their writings these horrors that were being perpetrated. But in fact, the men who were doing most of the killing, to the extent that they wrote anything at all, and some of them did, said that, no, it's the money. We're after the money. They had no intention of wanting to stay. Again, unlike the British settlers in New England and Virginia, who came, most of them, at least after the first generation, who came to stay and to settle. The Spanish had no intention, most of those Spaniards had no intention of settling. They came to get money. The money was being, the resources, the gold, the silver, and so on, was being shipped back to Spain, and then they wanted to return to Spain, rich landlords, and live out their lives there. So, yeah, again, the motivations are different in many cases, and the one that you're addressing certainly, I think, is a common one, yeah. Yep. I don't know. Let's give it a shot. That one, I think, does.
I would like first is I will come back to the word Holocaust as you defined at the beginning of your talk. I want to share with you just a small event I had. I had a correspondence about the program of our Holocaust series with a person who is in fact the cousin of Primo Levi. My friend Vittorio Luzzati is a very well-known scientist, and he was the cousin of Primo Levi. He has really opposed to the extension, in my correspondence with him, to the extension of the Holocaust to some of the events we report in this program. For instance, I was introducing the lecture about Spain and the Holocaust, and I was not at ease myself with the title, and I will tell you why. With American Holocaust, I feel the same as Vittorio Luzzati feels. When there is the second title, the destruction of America's native peoples, seems much more adapted to me. And without going to, I would say, semantics, I want just to ask you the following question. I'm Spanish first origin. The conquest of the Americas by the Spanish brought with them people like Bartolomé de las Casas. I think I will not define to the people, but certainly you are aware of who was Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a priest who took the side of the Indians to the point that all his life he was fighting for this idea, being a little pushed apart by the order itself of, I think he was a Dominican, if I am right. He was put aside, but he continued all his life claiming that there was a destruction of a people by them. So what I want to ask you is the following. Can a Bartolomé de las Casas exist under the Nazi regime? Was it possible even? Can we conceive this concept of somebody inside of the Nazi party claiming we are too harsh with the Jewish people? That's where I will push the definition much more than in semantics, where you have stated very beautifully what Holocaust means exactly.
Right.
It seems to me that the Nazi regime, who has produced the Jewish Holocaust, has been responsible, had no possibility to have a Bartolomé de las Casas or a Sahagún, if I can say to you. Sahagún was the man, a friar again, who translated the Aztec to Spanish. Nowadays, we will not know anything about the Aztec language if not of his contribution making a dictionary. That's what I wanted to share with you, and saying, of course, that I'm fully interested in what you
Right.
say. But maybe it's
Okay,
important
don't leave the
to
microphone.
have this.
Don't leave the microphone yet, because I want to ask, no, can you stay? Okay. One thing, just for the record, that's interesting about Las Casas, who is a person, and I can't pronounce his name as beautifully as you do, who was one of my heroes to some extent. On the other hand, he did propose that there was no necessity for enslaving the Indians because we could bring over Africans. So this was not somebody who, in a who embraced all of the people of the world as people who should not be enslaved and not be oppressed. But put that aside, that's not the question you asked, really. I am not an expert on the Holocaust. I don't pretend to be. I'll defer to anybody here who can answer that question. My assumption is that your assumption is correct. And that is that, no, I don't think Las Casas could have existed in Nazi Germany and survived. You're absolutely correct. And not only in Nazi Germany, but within the reach of Nazi Germany. I'm not sure how that specifically addresses the word Holocaust. I am not at all soft pedaling what happened in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s. It was ghastly, it was horrendous. I'm not somebody who wants to somehow marginalize or reduce the impact of that horror or that terror by speaking of others. I'm, on the contrary, and this is part of what I was talking about here today, I'm concerned that a kind of reverse Holocaust denial takes place among people who claim only one genocide really matters in human history, and the others, well, we can find a place for them, we can rank them, they were terrible, maybe it was ethnic cleansing, maybe it was a kind of lower level genocide or something. I, along with people like Israel Charny, who I don't know if you know his work, any of you, is a very controversial person in Israel. And he and I have corresponded and disagreed about things. But I tend overall to agree with him that there really is, this is not a zero-sum game where there's only so much compassion to go around. We don't have to elevate one people's experience and seal it off from everybody else in order to maintain compassion and understanding for those horrors. I think we're human beings, and we're big enough to understand that that this is one of the worst things, perhaps the worst thing, that human beings have ever done to themselves. And they do it and do it and do it, and they have done it and have done it and have done it. I, as I said in my talk, referred to the Holocaust only with reference to the Nazis' destruction of the Jews. I don't refer to the Holocaust in any other way. But I don't believe that we can take the word out of circulation with a lowercase h. That's all. So go ahead, sorry.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Sure.
One certainly can add in the 1940-1945 Holocaust, the Gypsy
Yes.
count, because it was the same idea
Right.
to eradicate
Right.
the community of Gypsies is less abundant, but this doesn't
Right.
make any difference.
Right. But again,
Yeah.
the Gypsies have their own name for that.
That's right. That's right.
And so, and they tend, I don't, again, I only know one or two Rama people who write about this and who think about this. but they tend not to associate themselves under the Holocaust. They also essentially defer and say the Holocaust is what happened to the Jews. We have our own term for that. So I agree with you, however, and I must say, and this is a judgment call on a lot of things, that the word Holocaust is used to the point of triviality in many, many, many cases. Where we draw the line and whether I was correct or incorrect in drawing the line where I did is something we can maybe agree to disagree about.
No? Okay. So you said at one point that that the American Holocaust is an event of the past, but the wreckage from it is something that we're still dealing with today. And I'm just wondering if maybe I can like push you on that a little bit, because I'm wondering if maybe it's the case that it actually is something that still persists, in the sense that not, we don't see government forces going out and slaughtering in a physical sense indigenous communities, but in a way we've seen colonialism work so well that now there doesn't need to be the forces going out and doing it. We've actually made it so that communities are very, very good at kind of exterminating themselves. Especially I'm thinking in terms of North American reserve communities that have the highest rates of
Suicide
violence and
alcoholism.
suicide, alcoholism, drug dependency, incredibly low literacy rates, and also kind of just the widespread ability of like mainstream political society to make all of those things invisible to us so that they don't come up, so that we don't actually talk about them, so that we can talk about race and racism without actually talking about indigenous people at all. And so I'm wondering if maybe you'd be willing to say that it's still going on, or if there's a particular reason in why you think that it's stopped.
Again, feel free to stay with the microphone if you want to. I don't know if everybody wants to leave. We want to hear this conversation, but I would take issue just with one thing that you said, and it may have just been a term that you would not maybe perhaps have wanted to use, or maybe you do. You suggested that somehow or other the system had become so efficient, I think. That's not your word or your phrase, but that the people were doing it to themselves, that were destroying themselves. And to me, that's edging very close to blaming the victims. Ultimately, they're not doing it to themselves. Even those who are committing suicide, I think, are not doing it to themselves. So there's, again, that's a fine point, I think. But in saying that, what I'm really saying is that I agree with you, that yes, this has become a kind of machine that goes of itself in the same way that we can have deeply racist society without any overt evidence of hate speech and racial hatred apparent on the surface of the society, because we've created institutions that are institutionally racist and simply take care of business on their own without all the rhetoric that was associated with racism in the past. So I agree with that. I guess the distinction that I would make, because I did conclude American Holocaust at the end of the 19th century, although I did make references to the killing in Latin America in the horrible, horrible genocidal killing in Latin America in the 1980s, comes back to the question of the word genocide. And this is a long discussion that I'll try to keep short because people are already trying to get up and leave. But historians over the many years have tried to figure, some historians have just made up definitions of genocide. And the reason they've made up definitions is because the Genocide Convention of the United Nations was cobbled together by a group of nations to somehow make sense of and to institutionalize a law that would say this, we cannot have this anymore. This is illegal, and nations must act against it. So in order to do that, they had to define it. The problem is, who is sitting around defining this? People who represent countries that in the past and at that time were committing genocide. I mean, it was like having the thieves sit around the table writing the law. So, for example, Lemkin had always had in his definition of genocide among the potential victim groups, political victims, people who were whole groups of political people who were being exterminated because of their politics. The Soviet Union would have nothing to do with that, because they had how many people in the gulags at the moment that they're sitting down writing this genocide convention? They had exterminated people for political reasons. So they simply could not have that. So the Genocide Convention does not include political groups as groups that are subject to a perpetrator group being brought to the bar because they kill those people. As a result, technically, the genocide in Cambodia was not genocide. And there are very, very few genocide scholars who will say that it was genocide. Ben Kiernan, who's a specialist, I mentioned him twice in my talk, who's a specialist actually in Southeast Asia and Cambodia, originally agreed with that, and he subsequently has changed his mind. But most of the genocide scholars in the world today would say it was horrible, but the victims were political victims, and that's why it's not a genocide. The same thing with the killing of Indians in Paraguay. The killers were able to extricate themselves by saying, yes, we killed all of those people, almost exterminated an entire people. But it wasn't because of the fact that they were Indians, which would have made them a protected group, but because their political activities were such that they deserved being exterminated. And therefore, yes, maybe that was not very humanitarian, and maybe it was a crime against humanity and so on and so forth, but it's not genocide. Anyway, that's one of the reasons why historians have tried, many historians and sociologists who write about genocide, have tried to create their own definitions of genocide. The problem with that is your definition includes this group, my definition includes that group, that person's definition includes one kind of activity, such as taking children, as the United Nations Convention does, taking children away from families and putting them among others, as has happened in Australia, most famously, and so on, and others don't. So therefore, then you've lost everything. So I think that really what we need to do, and I don't like this because I think the Genocide Convention has real problems, is that we just simply have to hold to the UN Genocide Convention. It's the only one, the only thing, the definition that exists that most people have bought into. Now, even then, there are arguments that can take place, and one of them has to do with this question of intent. I'm going to get back to your point right about now. The question of intent. And again, there are, within everyday criminal law in the United States, there are distinctions between specific intent and general intent that are very important. Actually, that question was debated internally in the Bush administration when what's his name, John Yoo was leading that group of attorneys in trying to justify torture. And if you look at the memoranda that were, the famous memorandum in particular was written by them, their struggle over the use of general intent and specific intent, because they decided, one group had tried to hide behind specific intent, saying we did not, in the torture that we're about to commit, we don't intend to torture, it's just that we're going to behave in such a way and do certain things that, yes, it's true, torture is likely to result from that, but that's general intent. That's not specific intent. Specific intent means you have to intend the thing itself, not just behave in such, I'm trying to give you a simple example. Somebody takes a car and drives down, there's a Broadway here, right? Drives down Broadway and turns the steering wheel and drives up on the sidewalk and kills somebody. Okay, now the law takes a very different position on whether they can determine that me, the driver of that car, wanted to kill that person and therefore drove the car to kill that person, or whether I simply drove the car knowing I would kill people and knowing that person would probably be killed, but not intending to kill that person. There's a distinction, and the punishment is different. So anyway, those are the kinds of things that international human rights people get into in their prosecutions of cases such as the Rwanda case and so on and so forth. And I guess what I'm saying, to come back to your point, which I think is a very good one, is that I think we should stay within the UN definition and fight about issues within that. And in that case, then we have to accept the word intent, however we define it, as part of the justification for our use of the term genocide. So I think that maybe, you and I could probably still disagree about this, but that what's happening today may not quite involve intent the way it involved intent when, for example, the governor of California, in his inauguration speech in 1852 or 1850, said, we must exterminate those Indians, and then put together troops to go out and exterminate them, and got money from the federal government to support that extermination campaign. That's different from driving people into a situation where their lives simply cannot be led, and then backing away and just letting it happen. It's a fine point. So I agree with your sentiment, but I'm not sure I disagree with whether the use of the term Holocaust should or should not extend to the present.
Okay, just one super quick
Sure.
follow-up. Like, I think that, so I agree with you about the intent, but I just want to, like, say that I think that the intent to exterminate has been replaced in a really large way by the intent to assimilate, which I am not sure is all that, like, if you look at the residential school policy, I'm Canadian, so I know the residential schools system in Canada a lot better, but if you look at the residential school policy, I'm not sure that, that you can pull apart the intent to exterminate with the intent to assimilate in that kind of example. So
Yeah, and actually, a case can be made that the Genocide Convention does cover that, and people have written about that in Canada and again in Australia in particular. Yeah.
Well, as somebody who is Native American, I'm Cherokee and Muskogee. Got 5, 6 other tribes. Basically, my family all ran off during the removal and hid out. I've lived on 3 different reservations, and my kids are all members of federally recognized tribes. When you're looking at genocide as a Native person, there was the physical genocide. There is the de facto genocide. A lot of people don't know that during the 1950s, President Eisenhower, with a stroke of a pen, extinguished more than 50 tribes. And a lot of those tribes have been trying ever since to get their federal recognition back, because when they lost their federal recognition, they lost their land, they lost the resources. It was the same thing that had been going on. It was legislating extinction. The policy under Eisenhower was, if we take their reservations away, they have to move into general society, and then within a generation or 2, they won't exist. And then there's no more Indian problem. I grew up right here in Nashville, and I grew up around mainstream society, being a person from a completely separate culture and having to deal with, why can't you just be an American? Why are you still speaking that language? Why don't you do what we want to do? And I fought with the Methodist Church. I grew up in the Methodist Church. In fact, there's a group of us that we call ourselves the Flying Finger Fellowship, because we deduced, after fighting with the church over being able to be a traditional Native person and be a Christian and function within the church as a Native person, we spent most of our time basically with our middle finger in the face of the church, because we were always having to fight with them over doctrines that had absolutely nothing to do with the Scripture. It had to do with their discomfort with our difference. And the schools still do this. My kids have had to fight the very same fights in school that I had to fight, that my mother had to fight, and so forth and so on, where you get one little chapter of maybe 4 pages and a few paragraphs, and it's so general it's useless. It talks about the Aztecs, it talks about the southeastern people, and it may mention the Cherokees and the Creeks. It talks about the northeastern people, and it usually mentions the Mohawks. And then it mentions Lakotas. And it's just useless. It's not taught. People don't understand that 3/5 of all the world's food crops were developed right here in the Western Hemisphere. Most of the medicines that most people use came from here. We were not only the greatest agriculturalists on the face of the earth, we were also the greatest pharmaceutical botanists. We had medicines for everything. The only thing we didn't have medicines for were European diseases because we had no familiarity with them. If we'd had them, we would have had something to cure them. And we don't get any credit for that. They'll say, oh, Sir Alexander Fleming invented penicillin. How could he invent something that my people had been using for thousands of years? I still know how to make penicillin because my great-grandma taught me how to. In fact, I've got the little crock jar that she used, that she got from her grandmother, that she got from her grandmother, and I have no idea how old this thing is. But it's always been used to make penicillin. I was taught as a child how to make various medicines. I was also taught our traditional ways, and I had an understanding, even as a little bitty kid, we didn't talk about that stuff with non-Indians. Because if we did, somebody was going to come down on us or they were going to twist it around and make it something that it wasn't. And we have, that kind of genocide that goes on too. Now, some of it, the alcoholism, the drug abuse, the dysfunction that exists within families, a lot of people wouldn't know it, and I hate to admit it, but sexual abuse amongst Native Americans is astronomically higher than it is for the rest of the population. It started with the boarding schools or residential schools because you had kids that were taken at the age of 5. They didn't see their families for 7 or 8 years. Their families were not permitted to raise their children. How can you be a parent when you're not allowed to raise your child? How can you be normal when you're not raised in a family? When you're put into boarding school and you are beaten for speaking your native language, you're mistreated, you're sexually abused. Every time they go to an old boarding school site and they start excavating because somebody's going to build something else, they start finding skeletons. Probably 25% of Native American children who went into the boarding schools disappeared. And they were never found. Those are people who never got to grow up, who never got to contribute. And we weren't put in those boarding schools to make us doctors or lawyers or leaders. We were put in there so that the girls could become domestic servants and the boys could become manual laborers. That was the only purpose. It was to make us servants. And there were some examples where that, where you had someone exceeded. Dr. Charles Eastman, Adam Beach played him in a movie. There were also the Suzanne Flechette, who was also not only one of the first female doctors, she was also the first native female doctor. So you had people who did succeed, but they were still Indian. And they still had to deal with the same old crap.
You mean succeed in Western terms?
They succeeded in Western terms, but they still had to deal with the same old crap. I don't mean to interrupt, I'd love to talk to you about this, Yeah.
but I'm wondering if, in case somebody else does have something to say, I was getting some signals that maybe we should
Okay.
wrap up soon. So I don't want to interrupt you, but if you can just sort of wrap up and
Okay.
then,
But the thing is, the genocide's still going on because the cultural pressures that are on Native people are still forget who you are, become who we say you are. And that's not just the blend into society, that's the fit into our little mythology that we have about you people, which actually to me is a lot more insulting than somebody saying, why can't you just be an American? I didn't live in teepee. My people never lived in teepees. We were farmers. And if I don't fit into your stereotype of how I'm supposed to be, I try to be nice about it, but sometimes it's just like, well, that's just tough for you if you can't accept that. There's other ways I put it that are not really appropriate for use in public, but, that's how it goes.
can I make one comment on what you said? One of the things you said, or reminded me to mention. It's very common, I think, for Americans and most people around the world to think of American Indians as somehow a singular people. And of course, that's a conventional thing that people from afar do to other people. Was it George Bush who referred to the country of Africa at one time? Many people think of Africa as a single place. The people who are, they're Africans, people of Asia. People of Asia. Try telling that to a room that's got some Koreans here and some Japanese here and so on and so forth, that somehow you're all the same. It's a very common, and actually in a kind of unintentional, I think, way, racist way, of making everybody the same. And American Indians are not all the same. There are hundreds of different original native nations, each of which had distinctive religious traditions, cultural traditions and ways of doing things, ways of living, and physiological differences. They did not. American Indians don't all look the same. They're very different. And the reason this is relevant to the question of genocide is because if there's one thing that I wish I hadn't said in American Holocaust, was I made at the beginning of the book, and I probably more than once, because I haven't reread the book for some time, reference to genocide in the singular. And really, what happened was a succession. I did say this in the book too, but the two sort of, I guess I was unthinkingly assuming they could live together. What really happened was serial genocide that took place over and over and over and over again over the course of 400 years. In some cases which the entire people were obliterated. Nothing remained. In other cases, not all Indian groups suffered genocide. Some didn't. But the variations are tremendous. And I think in all explorations of discussions about American Indians, and again, just as I said about the Holocaust, I'm not an expert on American Indians, I don't claim to be. When I entered graduate school, I was going to study slavery and racism, but mostly slavery in the United States, and I chose not to. This was in the early 70s, because I decided that a white guy should not be studying slavery. That was remember this was the 70s, there was a particular political moment in relationships between white people and black people. Other whites very successfully did study slavery, Herbert Gutman and various other people, but I decided not to do that for that reason. In the same way that when I've written about Native peoples in the Pacific and about American Indians, I don't claim to really be writing about Indians. I'm writing about what white people have done to those people. So I don't really claim to know much about American Indians, but from what little I do know, I think it's important for us to recognize how incredibly varied those groups of people are. Continue to be, but at one time, astonishingly were. When the numbers in North America, nobody knows what they were. The lowest estimates probably, we have more experts here than I am, and this, whatever the latest numbers are, have ranged anywhere from 5 million to 15 million. But within those 500 nations that existed, there was extraordinary variability and difference. Anyway, that's all. And I'm glad you brought that up, and also about the boarding schools, both of you bringing them up. Any other questions? Pardon? Is it time? I don't know, I was getting a little high sign over here.
I'll make it quick. So I think that one of the important things that I've gathered from the examples that you gave were just like how much these multiple genocides have been glorified or justified and kind of, brushed under as not really being actually as horrible as we know they are. So I was just sitting here thinking, like, if history were to be rewritten in a way that's more truthful to these horrors, these tragedies, how would that impact, especially for young people who are so often given a very glossy version of what history is in this country, or given at least from the perspective of, like you said, the victors? How would that impact their relationship to this nation as citizens, or just how they kind of contribute as members of society, how do you think that would impact young people if they began to really know, like, what the history of this country, like, that they're a member of, has done?
Well, I think it would be immensely beneficial, in the same way that I think it's immensely beneficial that the history of African Americans is finally, for some years now, has been taught and taught reasonably well, I guess, in some schools, and that there's an outpouring of writing and so on and so forth by and about African Americans. But specifically about genocide, I think a terrible disservice is done to, let's say, the Japanese by the concealment and denial of the horrors perpetrated by the Japanese against Koreans and against the Chinese. And there's tremendous resistance among some pockets in Japan to this. There is a documentary film made in Japan. It's a kind of underground film about the rape of, what's called the rape of Nanking, the killing, the horrendous, brutal killing of hundreds of thousands of Chinese by Japanese soldiers. It's causing all sorts of trouble. There's tremendous fighting about textbooks, high school textbooks in Japan, about whether or not that should be concealed, covered. On the other hand, in Germany, and Germany's got its problems, it's going to continue to have its problems. It's got neo-Nazis all over the place, it's got all sorts of problems. But I think Germany has actually shown the way that you can deal with the horrors perpetrated by your own people, by coming to terms with it, by having Holocaust memorials and museums, we can argue about whether or not denial of the Holocaust should be a criminal offense. That's not something that Americans buy into very easily. Canada at one time did have, I believe, it was a criminal offense, and the Supreme Court of Canada said it was not compatible with free speech and overruled it. But in any case, Germany, to the extent that any country has tried to come to terms with the horrors of its own history. And I think it's been beneficial. So I would say that it's not easy, but I would say in the long term, it's incredibly beneficial to a population to come to terms with the reality of what its people have done so that they don't do it again. Okay, anything else? Oh, yeah, okay, well, I'm getting two people waving at me to wrap up. I'm free to talk a little bit if you want afterwards, any individual you want to talk to. Thank you.